Hi, my name is Crystal Stone, and today we're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about gait throughout a human's lifespan. So I thought it was important at first to define gait. So our textbook has a loose definition for gait. In addition to that, I looked up a couple other sources. And ultimately, so the gait cycle describes the cyclical pattern of movement that occurs when someone is walking. So a single cycle of gait starts when the heel of one foot strikes on the ground, and it ends when that seam heel touches the ground again. And then just keeping in mind that whatever that first foot is doing, the other foot is doing the exact opposite in a fluid gait movement. So thought that was important. So in early childhood, when we're talking about characteristics of gait, and I'm just going to play the video as I'm talking so you can see what's happening here. This is one we used a few times throughout the course. So you see less coordination, and the movements are really focused on establishing balance. This is talking about new walkers. So these little toddlers are more flat-footed. They have limited to no arm swing, and I'll just play that again so you can see that. In addition, there's a short stride length, which helps them maintain balance, and their hands are in this higher guard position again. So a lot of what they're doing in early childhood pertaining to gait is really just focused on maintaining balance, right? Like just getting their footing and making sure that they don't fall. Some common early childhood abnormalities are something called in-toeing for early walkers. So that's when your feet turn inward while you're walking or running. A few slides from now, I have a good image of what in-toeing looks like and what out-toeing looks like, but we'll just talk about it for now. Some of the causes here, there's some super technical terms: femoral anteversion, internal tibial torsion. In short, it's the inward rotation of the thigh bone or the twisting of the shin bone that just naturally happens. I had looked up to see if this is something that happens as a result of childbirth, and the answer to that is no, it's not anything that happens during childbirth. Some of it might have to do with the placement of the legs when a child is in the womb. As I state here, it typically resolves on its own, though. So as the child, the early child or the young child, gets older, their bones sort of like straighten out so that inward rotation isn't there as much, and they go to a normal foot pattern and more narrow stance, which we'll talk about when we get to the adult section. So this is something that typically resolves on its own. The next thing we're going to talk about, and I will again go back to that kind of inward toe or outward toe. I just thought it was nice to see them both together. So the next thing we'll talk about, though, is childhood gait. So we're talking about kids who are like 30 months and older, so closer to that 3-year mark and older. So you start to see a more mature gait pattern. So it's less of, the flat-footed out-toeing, almost like looking like you're jumping. Pardon me. To walk, and something more resembling what adults are doing. You see the beginning of arm swings, although when you're looking at that younger age demographic, so the kids who are closer to that like 3-year age, the arm swings aren't as coordinated as they would be with like a 5-year-old child, for example. And the video linked here, which I won't go out to, that's one we saw a few times in class as well. What we see here are a toddler running, and both of her hands are going forward at the same time, and that's pretty typical when you see, and I'm saying toddler, I'm sorry, a child, so about 3 years old. So the beginning of arm swinging, although there's no oppositional movement in that arm swing, so it's less coordinated. The hands drop down from the high guard position that we talked about with early or new walkers into more of a middle guard position. So they're a little bit more stable than they were when they were babies, but not quite stable enough for, that low arm oppositional movement swinging. And another key fact is that when you're talking about a child, especially closer to that 3-4-year mark, they're really relying on momentum to propel forward versus their own leg strength. So in adults, which we'll talk about next, or soon I should say, you see that they are able to propel themselves by the muscles and the extension of their legs. And with little ones, they sometimes look like they're going to fall, even if they're not, because it is just a momentum-driven movement. So common abnormality in childhood gait is called out-toeing. So it's quite the opposite, literally the opposite of in-toeing. It's when your feet kind of turn outward while walking or running. I used to do this as a child, fun fact, and my mother said I looked like a little penguin walking. So this is caused by flat-footedness. And again, just quite literally the opposite of what we saw with in-toeing. So outward rotation of the thigh bone, outward twisting of the shin bone, and these things typically do resolve as the child gets older. So by 5 or 6, you're not seeing this as much. I really love this image from Gillette Children's Specialty Healthcare. It does a good job of showing what in-toeing is to the far left, what out-toeing looks like to the far right. Pardon me. And some of those more technical terms we talked about, like the internal tibial torsion, the femoral anteversion, and then some of these things we see at the bottom, like the external thigh-foot ankle, or TFA, down here, that would be contributing to some of that out-toeing that I had talked about. So I thought that was important to note. So early childhood and regular childhood physical and perceptual constraints include, for early childhood, you're just looking at underdeveloped muscles, right? So these babies haven't had to walk, so the muscles aren't developed yet. The bone structures are getting used to standing upright. They've done a lot of the, legwork, so to speak, to get to the point where they are walking, but they're not there yet. And then just a general spatial awareness. So these babies or, little ones. I think of my daughter who started walking when she was 10 months old, for example, so really, really little. They lack the depth perception to understand that, how far things are and how to coordinate their movements accordingly. So in childhood, so we're talking about, again, that 30-month plus range in childhood, growth spurts are certainly a physical constraint. So if you start to rapidly develop, then you have to get used to what it means to move or run with longer legs or, a longer limb movement. So, and then from a perceptual standpoint, perceptual constraint includes something called dual task interference. There's a really, really cool study that's linked down there, and it's in my references as well, from Boston University, where they talk about how children have difficulty both walking and doing something like holding a box. So that could be a perceptual task constraint, being having to do two things at one time. So in adulthood, we're looking at highly coordinated yet fluid series of movements, right? So they're highly coordinated, a lot of things happening at once, but it's fluid. So if you're looking quickly, it might not look like so much is happening, but there is a lot. So we're looking at a heel strike, a quick stance, toe-off phase. We're looking at full extension of longer limbs, so longer strides, right, because their legs are longer than children, and then a fluid oppositional arm movement, right? They're not doing, they also have a narrower stance. They don't need to stand with their feet a little wider than shoulder width apart anymore because the balance has been established for a longer period of time. Some interesting abnormalities in adult gait. I learned about something. So this is called antalgic gait, which is literally just limping. So it's a pretty common abnormality in adult gait, and it's the result of pain. And what you're literally doing here. Antalgic gait refers to a actually be quiet. See. Exactly. So, so what you're doing is you're avoiding to put pressure on the impacted leg or foot. This can happen with pinched nerves. This can happen with injuries and various things like that. A lesser common one that I learned about was something called a lurching gait. So it's lesser common, but it's more common among people affected by paralysis or weakness. And I think this is a really great video that demonstrates it. So we can see he's walking slowly, normal, great, right? We see the heel strike, we see the step off. Take a peek here. So in this lurching gait, you can see that your upper body can kind of jerk forward or backward to lessen the weight of the affected leg, and it's causing a much slower, much longer slide, and affected by weakness in the gluteus muscle areas. So
this is a normal gait.
Shut that off, and we'll keep going. Okay. So next we're going to talk about an older adulthood, what older adulthood gait looks like. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like it's the adult, but sort of reverting backwards, right? So we see someone who, is able to have the oppositional arm movement and the coordination, but we see reduced speed. And we also do see, once again, a kind of wider support base. And a longer time with both feet on the ground. So we saw similar things we saw things that were similar to that when we were looking at children, pardon me, and done for the same reasons, right? So the older adult gait is one that leads with the goal of not falling in mind. So that's what we see there. An abnormality in gait is, I sent a video right here, it's just called shuffling gait. So if you look at her, she's got minimal lifting of her feet. If you can see right here, like she's relying on this carriage, but even without the carriage, you could see a more forward-leaning posture, so she's hunched over a little bit. And I thought it was just important to note that this isn't just something you see in older adults. It's also a characteristic of Parkinson's disease. So that's something that if they're exploring whether you have Parkinson's disease, if you have this type of gait, it is indicative of that condition. So I thought that was important to mention. So adult and older adult physical and perceptual constraints include, for adults, fractures and sprains could certainly impact or provide constraints for how the gait looks. Some chronic conditions like arthritis and cerebral palsy, and perceptual constraints include low visibility within your environment. So let's say you're trying to balance while you're in the dark, or trying to walk around, your house to get a drink of water in the middle of the night, then those can certainly provide constraints. And then for older adults, we're looking at musculoskeletal constraints. And what I mean by that is things like osteoporosis, right? So like the weakening of bone structures. And then for perceptual constraints, things like dementia or reduced eyesight. So your eyes are an organ that deteriorates over time. So you might not be able to see as well, which could impact your spatial awareness. And as we learned earlier, spatial awareness is certainly a constraint when it comes to younger folks, right? When we're talking about those early toddlers who are just learning to walk. So that is important to mention. So here are my references. This is a study from Boston University that I mentioned right here, the influence of dual task constraints during walking for children. I think that's particularly interesting. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up. And I really enjoyed our class. Thank you. Bye.